Hello and welcome to Taiwan Insider. I am Natalie So.
And I'm Andrew Ryan.
Now, Taiwan is working towards enacting transitional justice, especially towards its victims of the authoritarian era from 1945 to 1992. Now, today with us, we have an expert on criminal justice and human rights in Taiwan and China. Seton Hall University professor Maggie Lewis. It's great to have you on the show.
Thank you for inviting me.
Now, transitional justice is a big issue in Taiwan. Why do you think this is important for Taiwan?
Well, Taiwan, as you just said, had this tremendously long period, a half century of authoritarian rule. And during that, there were a number of people who lost their lives. If they didn't actually get killed, they were imprisoned. Their families also suffered. And if you're going to move into the future as a society, you have to grapple with the past.
Now, recently we saw last year the founding of the Transitional Justice Commission in Taiwan, which is a government agency.
Right.
But actually, transitional justice has kind of been in the works for much longer than that. Can you talk a little bit about when it got its start and what's happened in the path to transitional justice so far in Taiwan?
Right. I think you can look back to when you started to have the Dangwai movement and people saying we need a change from having single-party authoritarian rule. And even at that time, in the 60s and 70s and going into the 80s, if it wasn't called transitional justice necessarily, there was still a clear understanding that people had felt wronged and they needed to have some sort of not just apology, but perhaps monetary compensation, bringing to justice those who had been responsible for the maltreatment, and other ways of saying we want to feel like our harms have been addressed by the government.
When you say Dangwai, you're referring to what would later become the opposition parties in Taiwan, the Democratic Progressive Party, but actually is now the ruling party in Taiwan.
Right.
So it's anybody that's not from the KMT. Now, in the early days, speaking about something like transitional justice would have been a problem during martial law, which lasted, through 87 and then on the outlying islands until 1992. So actually, they may not have even been really speaking publicly about it until the late 80s, early 90s.
Oh, certainly. It would have been very dangerous. And in fact, the first time I came to Taiwan was in 2006. And that was study a law that was really a vestige of that period, dealing with liomang, which we translate as hooligans. But it was a law that was used to really throw into a prison-like condition anyone who might not just be kind of a gangster, but a political opponent. And speaking out publicly against the KMT during the authoritarian era was putting yourself in grave danger. So any of those conversations would have been private. When you look at even as late as 1979, and you had a violent suppression of the protests in Kaohsiung, that it was extremely dangerous to show any disagreement with the ruling party.
So what do you think about the government's efforts now to clear the names of victims of that period or to make some reparations?
Right, and the transitional justice push in Taiwan has really taken place over now several decades. So you look back to the 1990s, and then you started to have apologies by the government, and Lee Teng-hui apologizing for at least some of the most egregious harms. So you look back to the 228, the February 28th, 1947 incident. This was a scuffle that turned into a very violent suppression of the then native population and leading to the death of unknown thousands of people. So you had an apology that came first from the government, then that was followed up by slowly starting to release information about what happened to people who had been disappeared or otherwise harmed, and then you started to see compensation, and that all happened before even Tsai Ing-wen took office. Mm-hmm. When Tsai Ing-wen took office, what was important too was you also had the DPP as the majority in the legislature. So you not just had the president saying we need to take the next step in transitional justice, you actually had the political means to do so.
So maybe this is why transitional justice didn't happen during the Chen Shui-bian administration from 2000 to 2008, because he didn't have a majority in the legislature. It was just the cabinet and the presidential office that was the DPP was ruling. Have you been surprised by how quickly it has happened in the last year or so? So many different steps have been taken in the push for transitional justice.
I think there was a pent-up demand, and there was a lot of preparations in the works. And then when Tsai Ing-wen came into office, it allowed some of that sort of pent-up preparation to come forward. So in that way, it's not surprising. But you do, the calibrating of the pace can be difficult, because the concern with transitional justice is that it can also look like victor's justice or look vindictive. And so you want this to be ultimately about a society dealing with the past wrongs, healing, and then moving forward in a way that is healthy and with a sense of understanding the past, but not being haunted by it. And if it's driven too much by one party, you always run the risk of people feeling like there are new wrongs being done in the process. And that can be difficult too.
Well, the KMT has complained about that. I mean, they think that they're being targeted, and they think that, you know, there's a lot of other issues or other peoples who have been wronged, such as indigenous peoples or sex slaves or other victims. What do you think about their perspective?
Well, first, I think that Taiwan has a long history. You know, this is looking back before the 1940s, and there are historical wrongs that haven't been fully addressed. Certainly, when you look at the indigenous populations, and it was only a few years ago that Tsai Ing-wen actually apologized to them, and she was the first president to issue a formal apology for the wrongs they have suffered. So clearly there's much to be done by looking back at how the indigenous population has suffered, but also then how do you preserve their cultures, their languages going forward, because that's the ultimate goal, is that I think that these cultures can flourish, and that one of the great things about Taiwan is that it is a pretty diverse place in many ways. The Japanese era, I mean, that's somewhat different because the Japanese were then pushed out, and so you don't have the same situation as with the KMT, where they're still here as much, so the influence is. But I look at, for example, on Dihua Street, there's the museum that's dedicated to the comfort women, the sexual slaves of World War II, and I think that's a fantastic example of transitional justice, because it's taking the stories of these women who for so long were so ashamed that they couldn't even talk about it. And it's memorializing it, it's helping them to heal, it's letting those stories live on. So all of that should happen. But the KMT was responsible for a lot of wrongs. So you want to have accountability without it coming across as vindictive. And people are going to vary in where that line is.
Do you think there's a way in which you can bring the KMT into the process of transitional justice? Is there a way that they could be doing it that they're not doing it right now?
They are involved. I mean, there are certainly still a lot of KMT legislators, and the commission is ostensibly nonpartisan, but of course you're always going to have people who come with baggage of whatever party they might be representing. I think, though, it needs to come across as a little bit more collaborative, and that might mean slowing the process down sometimes and allowing for other voices to be heard. But there's no doubt that it is a challenge to say we don't want to erase the past. We don't want to get rid of every statue, of every vestige of the authoritarian era, because part of dealing with the past is having some of that there to grapple with. But you also need to say, perhaps we do need to make some visible changes to what we see at schools, what we see at national parks, and that's going to be painful for some people.
Yeah, it looked like the Tsai administration was going to make a quick move to change things like the money, you know, because Chiang Kai-shek is on the currency here in Taiwan, or changes to the Chiang Kai-shek Memorial, of course, you know, which honors Chiang Kai-shek, who many think was behind a lot of the grievances during the White Terror period. It looks like they've taken a step back. Do you think that that's maybe an effort to kind of ease the process of transitional justice, or because they are responding to kind of people, you know, kind of quite up in arms about big changes to Taiwan's symbols?
Well, one thing that's great about a democracy, and also difficult about a democracy, is you have to constantly sort of read what your populace wants. And I think there was a lot of excitement about pushing transitional justice forward, but then there's these moments of saying perhaps we should sort of think about this a little bit more. Also, the government's busy. This is not the only thing that the Thai government is dealing with, right?
Yeah.
You know, we have, whether it be pension reform, cross-strait relations, energy policy, the economy, and so not all of the energy can be focused on this, either for the executive branch or for the legislature. So sometimes too, there's a lot that needs to get done, and sometimes having a lot to get done will give a little bit of a taking, not fully the brakes on, but allowing to think through some of these decisions in a way that people might feel like they aren't being just thrust on them.
So it seems like a lot of the things that happened before are the reason for the political tensions between the KMT and DPP, or the reason that there's two very diverse groups in Taiwan. Do you think that transitional justice will help heal some of these divisions in society?
Part of it is law. I'm a lawyer. I'm a law professor. I believe that law is important, and we have these new laws dealing with not just the most recent, but going back, compensation for victims. We're dealing with, as you said, declassifying documents. We're dealing with actually overturning convictions. Those are things the law can do. It can actually go in and say you are no longer down as being a criminal, when now we recognize what you were doing was peacefully advocating for democracy. But law can only do so much, and that a lot of this has to do with societal changes. Time will change things. You're going to get a new generation of people born in Taiwan who don't have the same immediate connection. Of course, through their families, they're going to hear stories. It'll still affect them, but it's not as emotionally immediate, and I think that can sometimes give some space. You also, by having time, you can have a chance to think about how people are taught about the past. Part of this is what the education system does. How do you teach what happened? I spent a semester studying in Germany, and one thing I found so interesting was to see how Germany had dealt with the World War II era, and to what extent you don't want the next generation to feel burdened or blamed for what happened even before they were born, but you want them to understand it.
And actually, Deutsche Welle is very proactive about talking about what happened during World War II. They're very upfront about it. Now, as a lawyer, I'm curious to know what you think the next laws should be passed in Taiwan to deal with transitional justice.
And some of it, again, is law, but a lot of it is implementation. As a person who studies what I think of as law in action, you can have the prettiest laws on the books, but if you're not fully implementing them, it just sort of is something that looks nice. I do think that getting as much information out about people's past, opening up files, of course there are going to be some national security issues, but I think those are often overemphasized when a lot of this is just about people who want to know what happened to their family, and that seems to me something that should be less partisan. I also think that we're now close to 6,000 convictions that have been overturned. That should be continued to look at, because that's a hugely powerful thing for someone and their family to have that addressed. There's been quite a bit of monetary compensation. That's something to keep looking at. But of course, you can't give people back time or lives. So I don't want to say that that's the answer. And then it's really, I think, going to be the longest process dealing with the imagery. What do we do about what's on the money? What do we do about national monuments? And that, I think, is going to perhaps be the slowest part of this process.
Now, you recently wrote an article in the CNN comparing Taiwan with China and how it's dealt with its past as an authoritarian government, and even killing a lot of thousands of people, and how China could learn from Taiwan. So how do you think Taiwan is impacting China and Hong Kong in the way that it's dealing with its past?
When I first came here, as I said, I was studying some of these vestiges of the authoritarian era, and the goal then was that China still had what was called re-education through labor, which was a technically non-criminal sanction, but it looked essentially like you were being put into prison for 3 or 4 years. And one of the ideas then was maybe that Taiwan's transition away from this authoritarian period could help think about how to slowly decrease some of those more draconian laws in China. That was 2006. The reality is that it's, I think, harder today in 2019 to do those sort of legal reforms. And in fact, in China, we've seen, if anything, a hardening and a more repressive atmosphere. So in saying, let's look at China and Taiwan, I don't want to say that where Taiwan goes, China will follow. But I do think when you look at the 30th anniversary of the Tiananmen massacre, which just happened, and how no remembrance is allowed publicly in China, 30 years out from the 228 incident from 1947, from that massacre, you also in 1977 didn't have the ability to have a public remembrance, let alone a government protest without great risk. So it's just to say the future hasn't been written. Just because it might be a particularly difficult time doesn't mean that we should assume that change is not possible at some point down the road.
So what do you think could help affect change in China?
I think getting information is so important. I worry a lot about restrictions on access to information, and we've certainly seen that just in the past month with the massive protests in Hong Kong. I was in Kunming in Yunnan province when the first of those marches were happening, and I was with a group of very well-educated, informed Chinese citizens, but yet they had no news of what was happening in Hong Kong. And that I think makes it very difficult. So without access to information, it's hard to make informed choices.
I want to talk a little bit about the push against the extradition law in Hong Kong. This, of course, is not related to transitional justice, but it is your field. It is also has to do with law in China and in Hong Kong. Now, the extradition bill, of course, would allow for sending people from Hong Kong to China for prosecution, and these would be either convicted or suspected people who've, suspected to have committed a crime. How much of a concern is that for Hong Kong?
Yeah, and it was. I did not expect that 1 to 2 million people would have taken to the streets over this. I think it was really surprising how, of the many issues that could galvanize society, that this really struck a chord. And I think it was in part because it cut across groups. It wasn't just an issue for the young, or it wasn't just an issue for the business community. This is a way that a lot of people in Hong Kong suddenly felt vulnerable, and it was because I think that there's a lack of safeguards that were in the proposed bill. And we can debate whether it's dead, it's not withdrawn, we don't know if it will be revived like a phoenix from the ashes, but that this worry that even though extradition, transfer of suspects between countries or jurisdictions happens regularly, that's not surprising, but there should be in place just fundamental safeguards about why the person is being transferred, what kind of process will they face once they get there, and you could see the Hong Kong populace saying, we don't feel confident that we're going to be treated fairly through this process, and that was really telling.
And usually with extradition bills, it's when a country kind of trusts the legal system of the other country, and it's that scenario in which they would set up this sort of extradition bill. So it's a clear sign that the people of Hong Kong don't trust the judiciary in China.
Yeah.
Now, as a lawyer and somebody who really understands the law in China, do you think that that's valid?
It's valid to have concerns, and part of it is there is a lack of transparency, and so we know some things and then there's a lot we don't know, but what we do know is there's an over 99% conviction rate, and a high conviction rate is not surprising, because if prosecutors are doing their jobs, they should not charge someone unless there's a high likelihood the person would be convicted. Otherwise, prosecutors are charging too widely. So high conviction rate alone, I don't worry about. That high, you start to wonder, is there really a searching process at trial beyond once that indictment is brought?
What is a normal conviction rate?
And what is normal? I mean, the U.S., I always say don't study the U.S. system, because the U.S. is, the U.S. functions based on plea bargaining. You can basically not find trials for misdemeanors, for light crimes. There are more trials for the felonies, the more serious crimes, but even then, almost all cases in the U.S. are dealt with versus just by a bargain that you agree. And so in that way, it's kind of hard to say which ratio or what percentage, but the concern is partially that, do we think that the courts, especially in political or sensitive cases, are really questioning the police, questioning the prosecutors, and it's also concerns based on whether defense lawyers are able to really zealously represent their clients. And there are a number of defense lawyers who've been disbarred. They've even been convicted of crimes themselves. That it is valid for the people of Hong Kong to worry about what kind of system they would face.
What about someone like yourself who is outspoken about human rights in China And this bill also applies to people who visit Hong Kong. Do you ever feel threatened about your own safety?
I believe in engagement. I think now we're at a point where certainly with the U.S.-China relationship that there's a big debate about what is the future of that relationship. Trade has been in the news the most, but just more generally, how do we engage? How do we deal with each other? I still go to China for meetings. I believe that even if you disagree with someone, you should be able to sit down and have a conversation. And but I do think that especially the December arrests of the two Canadians, Spaver and Covering, that it made people take pause and say that we do need to be more aware, though, of risks. But I'm still showing up for conferences.
And what about that extradition bill? Do you think it threatens visitors to Hong Kong as well?
If it is phrased that if you are on Hong Kong soil, you may be transferred, then anyone who's even going through the airport, and we saw this situation not in Hong Kong, but in Vancouver with the CFO of Huawei, with Meng Wanzhou, where she was not planning to stay in Canada. She was transferring through the Vancouver airport, going to a third country, but that was used as the opportunity to arrest her. So this would not be unique to Hong Kong, but if the law is phrased that by being physically present on that soil, you are subject to that law, then people should think about what that means, given whatever their personal circumstances are.
So there is reason that people are protesting. I mean,
and it's bigger. It's not just about extradition. I think that was the issue that sort of sparked much wider concerns, because we have seen an erosion on freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, some of these fundamental freedoms, and so the people. I'm not from Hong Kong. But I believe that whatever population is someplace, they should decide their own future. And there was definitely concerns, even before the extradition bill, that one country, two systems was eroding closer to maybe one country, 1.5 systems, or something along those lines.
Right, that was supposed to be in place for 50 years,
right.
One country, two systems, and we're now, what, how many years in? My math isn't
22.
great. 22, yeah.
So, and it wasn't even just that there was supposed to be no changes for 50 years and then suddenly everything would change after a half century. I think a lot of expectations in 1997 would that be over the coming years, there might be, if not one person, one vote, like in Taiwan, at least there would be a move towards more representation and direct democracy, and we haven't seen that.
Are you optimistic when you're talking about the legal situation in China and in Hong Kong?
I'm an optimist by nature. I couldn't do this work, I think, if I was a pessimist. It'd be too depressing. But I'm a long-term optimist. And I think when you look at history, you see that there's more challenging periods, more repressive periods. There's periods of opening. So I think, first of all, this might just be one of those more challenging periods, and we don't know how long that will be. But I also think you just don't know what's going to happen. Even when martial law was lifted here, a few years before it happened, I don't know how many people would have put money down on betting that martial law was going to end when it did. It's hard to predict.
Well, that's a great way to end the show, I think.
Yes.
On an optimistic note.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Maggie Lewis. We've been speaking with Professor Maggie Lewis from Seton University. She is a criminal justice expert in Taiwan and as a visiting scholar as well. So it's been great having you here, Maggie, and thank you for joining us on Taiwan Insider.